So yeah, Hakim released this video, which I guess a bunch of people, for one reason or another, particularly wanted me to react to, the economic calculation problem. So for those that don't know, the economic calculation problem is just the idea, basically, that a government or like one single entity is going to have a fairly difficult time calculating what inputs they need to cultivate and what outputs to make from those inputs on an economy-wide scale. This is an argument used typically to discredit the idea of centrally planned economies, right? That it's just too complex and it's just too hard a thing for the government to do, or like a singular entity to do, to actually plan an entire economy in general. Oh, there's the yeah, there's the message from a Mouthy Infidel saying, "You're talking to Matt Brunig? I knew it would happen." Let me message him back real quick. I just leaked DMs. I can't believe it. All right, well, let's do it. So yeah, so that's the context of this video. Let's get into it. Let's start watching this video. I obviously, in this regard, Hakim does not believe that the economic calculation problem is a particularly good argument against a more centrally governed economy. So let's see what his argument is.
Myself from writing scripts, so blame my workaholic
I can't stand that there's this blue thing on the underneath. 130,000 subscribers. I was wrong. Let's do it.
Here's a highly requested video, the so-called economic calculation problem. Now, this is something that really is a non-issue, and most people that invoke the ECP know very little of the details of the nearly century-long now discussion revolving around it. They just read some libertarian Reddit post or something that told them it somehow destroys socialism, when all it does is show the limited creativity of those that defend capitalism. Regardless, let's hop right in and see what all the noise is about.
There's the snark that I mentioned that made him somewhat famous. Let's do it.
This is, of course, timestamped, so feel free to jump around if you'd like. Chapter 1. What is the ECP? Now, the ECP really refers to two separate so-called problems, the knowledge problem and the economic calculation problem proper. I personally see little point in separating the two, as the solutions to both are intertwined, but I want to give you all the facts. The basic overview was given by von Mises and built upon further by Hayek. The argument goes as follows. Rational economic decision-making is not possible without price signals provided by genuinely competitive markets based on private ownership of the means of production and investment on the basis of profit maximization.
This is a pretty good definition, I guess, on like the foundation of the economic calculation problem. The idea would just be that price signals are like a really good way to distribute goods and determine, you know, when you need to produce things, what you need to produce. And of course, there's caveats here. You know, a competitive market is obvious. You know, this is where obviously sometimes price signals don't always work that effectively. But, you know, competitive market, private ownership, things like that.
Note the word rational. Now, the smart ones amongst you almost immediately see that this is a statement on platitudes and assumptions, not reality. In fact, it's a statement so endowed with ideology as to make Zizek blush. All the basic assumptions are provably wrong, and that'll be shown soon. The question basically goes, how could planners, be they all of society democratically contributing to a collective plan, or a more limited top-bottom and bottom-up highway between enterprise councils and a central planning authority, decide how to coordinate production, what to produce, how much, at what stage, with which raw materials, how many raw materials, at the most efficient level, etc.
Right.
All this information needs to be gathered, calculated, parsed, and redistributed.
So he's still talking about what the ECP is, I guess. Let's keep going. I didn't realize how long. Looks like he's got another minute on it.
At all levels of the economy. Mises' answer is a boring one. It isn't possible for them to do so, hence the market remains. A side note being that this doesn't argue against socialism per se, but more against planning. There are advocates for market socialism, for example, of which I am not one of them, and I'll discuss this in a bit as well.
This is interesting. So he says this is an argument against central planning, but not socialism. But then he says he's not a market socialist. So hopefully in this video, I don't recall if he does, hopefully he gets into his, like, what his thought is and his sort of ideas surrounding how the market should be organized is, because that would obviously be, I suppose, a little bit required. What up, nerd chat, Bossit? Okay, that's the kind of toxic attitude that economics does not need. Good sir or madam or non-binary person.
Mises' general claims that there's no possible way we can gather, process, and communicate all the data in real time across the whole economy in a way that would reflect the complexity, particularly in regards to supply and demand. Seems they never grow out of that phase. Since it can't be done by planning, as apparently all call.
By the way, I don't know if this is what he does, but does he literally use, maybe someone in the chat, does he literally use, like, you know, Chinese propaganda footage? Like, what? I don't know where this is. Every video of his is like this. It has like footage of, I guess I would presume, workers in socialist societies just working and eating and doing stuff. But is this literally like propaganda footage? I don't know, right? But it's always struck me as a very interesting aesthetic for a video. So look at his avatar; it's red. Yeah, it is. Yeah, his avatar is a sort of iconography of Vladimir Lenin from Russia, obviously.
While so many errors in production as to bring the whole economy down, it must be left up to the market. In fact, he implies socialism is impossible because of this so-called fact of nature. He further claims that every aspect of production, from the cost of all inputs at all times to the locations of inputs and products, and changing demands and tastes of purchasers, is encompassed by price. Hayek's formation of the calculation problem is, in my opinion, much stronger. He retreated from the impossibility argument and instead stated that socialism could possibly calculate rational prices, hence breaking with Mises, but he questioned the practicality of it doing so, implying superior efficiency through the market, so the core of the argument really doesn't change. There is more nuance to this, as with all things, and that'll be touched on shortly. But, chapter 1.5. Why even bother discussing this?
So I do remember watching this. I don't remember what this section is, but why even bother discussing it? I'm curious what he's going to go into in this section. I wonder if it'll be like, I don't know. I'm so curious. Why even bother discussing this? What could that infer what this chapter 1.5 is going to be about? It's going to be interesting, but it ranges in my head from like being exasperated and like, this is like such a stupid, argument. I don't even see the value in talking about it. All the way to like maybe a more thoughtful, this is an understandable criticism, but I don't think it's very let's see how it goes. Does he ever talk about the welfare theorems? I don't know what you mean, Bad Bayesian, but he might talk about welfare somewhat in his videos. Maybe not this one, but maybe some of them.
In my opinion, the discussion of the problem is pointless because the vast majority of the people that bring up the ECP line aren't trained economists or even knowledgeable in the field, but a bunch of...
Oh, okay, I see. So it's more of an attack on the people making the argument. The people making the economic calculation problem, they're not even like real economists, right? So like they're not even knowledgeable about economics. So why ought we take any of what they say seriously on the issue? I don't agree fundamentally with this criticism. I made a whole video about I don't remember what I called it, but it's like what does it mean to have a degree in economics or something? And in that video, I kind of go through the idea that it's probably unfair to immediately discredit someone's criticism, even if you disagree with it, just because they're not like a trained economist or have written or scripts or written articles or made videos about the topic. I think that's a little bit unfair, and I don't think that this really is a good argument for him to bring up, in my opinion, but let's see where he goes with it. It's only like 20 seconds into the chapter.
People who've learned a catchphrase they think is heavier than it really is. Anyone even moderately knowledgeable about what they're talking about would know that this really isn't as damning of a critique as it's made out to be in some places. This doesn't mean the discussion shouldn't take place, though. You should just be a little strategic with the way you go about it. Point out the ignorance in a calm and cordial way, and don't give in to the flawed presuppositions of the argument. For one, we'd have to agree on what rational economic management is. Cut through the propaganda and you'll see that to them, rational only seems to mean what serves the desires of investors and shareholders. To socialists, rational implies meeting needs regardless of profitability. Researching knowledge...
Well, it's funny because he says, like, it's funny because in this part he's saying, well, people don't even understand economics, the ones that make this criticism, but then he goes on to seemingly not know what rational means in the context of economics, right? So in economics, rational decisions are decisions which you make because you think they are better for you, right? So if I eat an apple, if I buy an apple and eat it, I'm making that decision because in my head I am better because I've eaten that apple. Now, this does have some sort of practical limitations, right? Or like it leads to some kind of it's kind of an absurd way to define rational in some respects. So, for instance, I remember I once heard a professor say, in economics, if someone is severely schizophrenic and thinks that the best thing for them to do is to like, jump off of a bridge because the voice in their head told them to, that would be an economically like a rational thought as the way that economics defines it, right? If we made it actually economics, like if someone who is severely mentally ill said, I need to liquidate my entire life savings and buy a bunch of, I need to convert it into quarters and then I need to go spend it all in, my local arcade because that's what I just need to do, right? That's probably not the best financial decision. It's probably not good for that person. but it's rational in the sense that it's the person thinks that that is what's best for them, right? So it's a foundational sort of assumption in economics, which Hakim seems to have either misinterpreted or applied a sort of definition, which is, rational economic decision to most economists is just the idea that, whatever is best for the capital elite or the profit, the profits of the firm or something like that, which I think is probably a little bit wrong. So Bossett provides in chat maybe a more technical definition: decisions that an actor believes will maximize the value that returns to themselves for however they define value. Yeah, exactly, Bossett. Pretty much what I said. That's how that's how an economic thinker, that's like the technical definition of what a rational act in economics is, which has its limitations, but I think that Hakim is probably to some extent misinterpreting what that is, or he's like misapplying, he's like applying like sort of a bad faith or like a perhaps a motivated reasoning to people who talk about rational economic decisions.
Novel treatment for rare diseases is rarely, if ever, profitable, yet it is still a rational thing to do, just not to Mises, Hayek, and their disappointing adoptees.
So he brings up a statement here, which is like, sometimes it's not good to, it might not be an economically rational decision to research certain diseases because they might be so niche, things like that. So for instance, the studies that I've seen, or like the literature that I've read, says that the government tends to do very well when researching very niche sort of like boutique style diseases that like nobody has, because the market doesn't prioritize those diseases, because any treatment resulting from a disease that only like 10 people have wouldn't be very profitable, right? So why spend billions of dollars researching it, right? And so on this point, he's brought up a good point, but I think that the problem here is that frankly, nobody who would make the argument that economic calculation is a reason to be against central planning or socialism would say that there's no role for the state, right? I think that this is where he probably is being a little bit, I would say, less than charitable to the people making this criticism.
Secondly, we're operating on two different definitions of efficiency. To the pro-market side, they mean profit maximization. They try to dress it up in all sorts of rosy language, but in the end it all boils down to what makes the most money regardless of utility, as they rely on the flawed assumption that whatever is profitable is useful /
I don't think most capitalists would say that the most efficient thing is always the thing that makes the most money. I think that that's probably not a true statement. I think that generally when we talk about economic efficiency, we tend to talk about market clearing mechanics. So the idea that, the demand meets the supply, there's not like a dead weight loss, right? There's not a shortage, there's not a surplus. That tends to be how I hear efficiency discussed. Now, to be fair, there might be some weirdos on Twitter that say like efficiency is when businesses make a lot of money, but I don't. Again, I think this is probably a less than charitable, sort of interpretation of people who might bring up this argument. Mises might argue for no state intervention, but that's a specific kind of libertarian. Yeah, sure. That's kind of my point, Bevins, is that, I don't really think that this is I don't think Hakim is really presenting a very charitable view of what the opponents who might bring up economic calculation as a problem would actually say.
Increases general well-being / improves society / meets a need, and so on. Even with that said, only the smart ones will get far enough to admit this. To socialists, on the other hand, efficiency is measured according to need first. How many calories, how many housing units, how many roads or hospitals or schools, etc. Furthermore, the entire argument, and Mises' conception in particular, hinges on a world of horse-drawn carriages and a lack of...
Oh wait, hold on. Let's back up here. I want to hear that again.
So on. Even with that said, only the smart ones will get far enough to admit this. To socialists, on the other hand, efficiency is measured according to need first. How many calories, how many housing units, how many roads or hospitals or schools, etc. Furthermore, the entire argument, and Mises' conception in particular...
Okay, so I think he didn't mention luxury goods for a reason here, but I think charitably what I can say is that in Hakim's society, I think that even though he's only mentioned like basic needs, I think in Hakim's ideal society, you'd still be able to like go see sports. You'd still be able to, go out to eat or something. You'd still have these sort of like, luxury type things that people can participate in, I assume. But maybe he'll mention that later in the video.
Hinges on a world of horse-drawn carriages and a lack of instant communications. His arguments fall apart when we take into account satellites, the internet, and modern computing. By the 1940s, the theoretical responses to Mises, Hayek, and Co. in relation to the ECP solved this non-issue, especially in relation to consumer goods. By the 50s, Kantorovich proved that you can carry out rational economic planning and optimize production without money. Lange, Davidson, Cockshott, and dozens more have further contributed to this very long and very tired discussion at this point.
So he does this a lot in his videos where like he doesn't tend to go into studies that I've seen that often. He does it every now and then. Don't get me wrong, Hakim will, but he'll often do this where it's like, here's a list of recommended reading to read more about it, or like here's several names that I've read and like the things that they've proven to be correct, right? And you have to take that, unfortunately, with a grain of salt if he doesn't go into it, right? So I imagine if we were to look up every individual study that because he just referenced like 3 or 4 different studies. And if they're not studies, they're books. He often references like, here's an entire book that I'm drawing a conclusion from, which is, I think that best practice when making a video is to maybe pull a few passages and explain how the book actually comes to that conclusion. So you have to take that with a little bit of grain of salt, right? I don't actually think that it's the case. I mean, yeah, I think that you could probably build a theoretical model that doesn't have money and works, right? But that's a far cry from like, is it actually implementable and practical? He references like Cockshot that has pretty, I think, incorrect ideas about like how you can centrally plan an economy with computers, right? I don't think generally it's proven that, oh yeah, actually you can centrally plan an entire economy with like the computational power that we have today. A lot of the criticisms that I've seen in that regard is that a lot of the papers that espouse such an idea don't typically develop a dynamic planning mechanism, right? So like you might be able to click go on a script and it might be able to, take a bunch of inputs and say, here's the optimal outputs, right? But how dynamic is that, right? Can it run every single second? Can it, actually handle the complexity of like, I don't even know, like the billions or trillions of things that come into and go out of an economy the size of like the United States or something like that, right? I'm not really, I don't know if that's actually the case.
Just remember, this is an ideological argument, not one based on the facts. A learned catchphrase, like so many others. With that said, though, let's continue on to Chapter 2, the failures of the market. To the disappointment.
Okay, so I think I'm a little disappointed in this chapter, right? Because he still hasn't built a case for why how do I put this? He still hasn't really built a case for why the economic calculation problem is wrong, right? So what he's done here is he said, what is the economic calculation problem? And he's also said, the people that argue for the economic calculation problem are kind of dumb for one reason or another. And it now appears that he's going on to, well, what's wrong with all these market mechanics, right? But the reality is, you could say like the market has these problems and has these failures, but that still isn't like a positive argument for why the economic calculation problem itself is wrong, right? Because the burden of the pro-market people is just to say, well, markets are better than like a fully planned system, right? And I feel like he's not meeting that burden right now. Or, well, like his burden's the opposite of that, to prove that, essentially planned system is better than market. But I don't know. It's kind of a lot of there's a lot of potato in this video so far, and I'm trying to get to the meat. But let's see what he says here. Maybe he ties it in effectively.
Of the people who invoke the ECP, markets, prices, and everything else related in the real world don't exactly work how the argument presupposes. The economist Robin Hanel argued that markets are actually systematically inefficient because externalities are pervasive and because real-world markets are rarely truly competitive or in equilibrium. For all this discussion of supply and demand, ideal and rational price.
Right, so I think that this is where he's quoting a somewhat obvious conclusion, which is that perfect competition is a theoretical construct. No market is perfectly competitive, and no market is free from externalities. However, that doesn't, like, you can actually make that statement, but again, still be pro-market. I think that he's made a video, it seems that's, he's actually made a video, ironically, that it seems like he's planned for people not to fully engage and understand what he's talking about. And I think that's a little bit unfortunate here because it's a fairly provocative title, right? The worst argument against socialism is the economic calculation problem, right? So obviously, just because markets have failures or like markets are less than like perfect competition most of the time or every time, because perfect competition is kind of a theoretical construct, that still doesn't actually mean that you should be against the sort of market mechanics for distributing goods. But let's see what else he says.
Prices, self-regulation, etc. Important realities are sidestepped. Like, for example, manipulation of supply through arbitrary pricing or market supply manipulation, hoarding, lobbying, or
manipulation of supply through arbitrary pricing. And then what's the other thing he said?
Manipulation of supply through arbitrary pricing or market supply manipulation.
Market and supply manipulation. Okay, so I feel like he's just repeated himself.
Hoarding, lobbying, or manipulation of demand, brands as status.
Okay, hoarding, lobbying. So he said artificial pricing manipulating supply, I think, and then hoarding and lobbying. So these are like how we might expect manipulations of supply, like sort of extra market mechanisms that manipulate supply. Okay, let's see what he says about demand.
The symbols, psychological targeting for artificial demand, simulated peer pressure, unethical consumer targeting, like for example through children, or through
Simulated peer pressure. I don't know what he means by that. Does someone have an idea of what does it mean to simulate peer pressure? Oh, well, maybe he's saying like, well, maybe it's like, maybe there's an advertisement that's like, everyone's buying this product. Don't be a fucking loser and don't buy it. Maybe that's what he means. I'm not really sure, but yeah, it seems like he's attacking sort of the psychological side of advertising. But let's see what else he says.
through collusion, or one-sided buyouts, or planned obsolescence, or monopolized sourcing, or. The simple matter of the fact is, these idealized, uniformly competitive markets found in textbooks don't exist in reality. Real markets don't conform to those models, are limited and manipulated both internally and externally, and are at a stage of capitalist development in which truly free and fully competitive
Simulated peer pressure is influencer marketing. So it's like, hey, I'm Kim Kardashian, buy this lipstick. I guess that's what you would call that simulated peer pressure. Okay. Oh yeah. I just never heard of that concept, if I'm honest. Is it even possible to have a real life system that doesn't occasionally, okay, it's hard to read is it even possible to have a real life system that doesn't occasionally regularly fail? Error handling is always required. No. Yeah, I mean, no system's perfect. I'm sure even Hakim would say that. But I think right now he's painting an overly negative picture of markets, right? So fundamentally, what he's said so far is sometimes markets don't work, right? Which, again, that's not really an argument about like why the economic calculation problem is failing. He's not even gotten into that in this video yet. If you want to know what rational means in economics, ask Mike from PA. Well, maybe he does. Maybe he does know. That's he's somebody.
Markets are not only impossible, but also highly undesirable to capitalists and their lackeys. With that said, though, let's start simply. Supposedly, the market is the most efficient mechanism for the allocation of resources. If that really is the case, though, why have they done such a shit job of it all? Boom and bust cycles, the associated severe recessions that drown countless millions into poverty, destroying whole economies in the process. All of this happens due to mismatches between required inputs and produced outputs. I thought prices and market mechanisms were supposed to prevent such gross mismatches. If the market remains so efficient, why is it that when these disastrous failures happen, capitalism isn't saved by market mechanisms, but by government bailouts and pump priming? Legitimately.
So again, I feel like he seems to fundamentally just be repeating himself here, right? So again, like markets aren't perfect. That doesn't mean that they're still not good, right? So and also just because he's basically saying like, oh, well, the Keynesian idea of, stimulating demand during a downturn, this is like proof that markets don't work, right? And I think what it's proof of is that during downturns, markets are not preferable to government intervention in the form of stimulus, right? So it seems like you can make a positive case for, yeah, government stimulus is a good thing, but also be in favor of like government, or also be in favor of sort of market orientation of economics, right? And I think that an assumption that a lot of people make, which is not true, I don't think, is that there's also volatility in the output levels of the sort of Soviet centrally planned and like sort of Maoist centrally planned systems as well, right? So the idea that they didn't go through cycles of boom and bust it doesn't seem to be true based on my reading of the data. But let's keep going.
If the market was really as great as it's painted out to be, why is it that practically all of developed capitalism has been crawling along economic stagnation since the Great Recession? Growth of inequalities unparalleled, stagnant wages, the crumbling of infrastructure, hell, even climate change. How is it that the all-knowing and all-efficient market hasn't solved any of these issues, and practically everything that benefits the general populace over the profits of a few are so dependent on state financing and public sector efforts? But
let's see what he's asking. He's about to ask a sarcastic question, so maybe that'll clarify.
Government meddling, blah blah. It's the same hard argument over and over.
Okay, I don't even know what he means by that, but I mean, again, he seems to just basically be saying like, if you believe in both state involvement in an economy in the form of welfare or like stimulus bills, somehow you're admitting that markets don't work. I don't think that that's actually true, right? I mean, even the Chinese central planners under Deng realized that markets can have a positive effect under even a managed system like the Chinese sort of state capitalist system that they started to develop under Deng, right? So, I feel like he's really failing to actually argue his point in the video, which is the economic calculation problem is not true, right? He's making a counterattack rather than actually providing any sort of case for why the economic calculation problem isn't true. I guess I don't know if that's fair, because he is saying that well, if you're saying market, if you're saying like, oh well, we can't actually determine the inputs and outputs because it just doesn't work, right? I guess he's saying, well, actually your mechanism doesn't really work very much either. And I think that he is providing a fairly oversimplified version of the relatively common belief in modern economics, which is, yeah, markets are good, but they're not perfect, right? And it's important to have government involvement in sort of, the regulation of markets to make sure that they clear properly and, lead to sort of equitable development.
The basic economics theory that as long as enterprises are free of state interference, markets would suddenly make everything as productive and efficient as can be, and all for the public good too. But this vision greatly overstates the role of markets. Aptly put by Cockshot, even in so-called market economies, markets of the sort described in economics textbooks are the exception restricted to specialist areas like the world oil and currency markets. The main industrial structure of an economy depends on a complex interlinked system of regular producer-consumer relationships in which the same suppliers make regular deliveries to the same customers week in and week out. Markets are anything but rational at allocating resources, if we're being honest, and the claim of price signals being the shining star that guides the Magi to Bethlehem is equally, well, let's just say, putting too much faith in the idea. Price signals are good at indicating where profit can be made, so that industry is mobilized. But profitability, if we're being generous, is only tangentially linked to society's well-being. They can claim all they like that the only way to profit is to solve the needs or wants of the consumer, but that is demonstrably not true. Firstly, this depends on you being a consumer in the first place, meaning you have to spend money to even get a look from this benevolent system. Even with that said, there are many ways to profit while neglecting or harming consumers, at all levels. People starving in the wealthiest country on earth is an example of this. Homeless people next to people's homes. Do I need to yet again?
Yeah, I don't know who profits from people starving. I don't really understand that argument. He seems to have said that. Well, I guess what he's saying is you can still profit while people are starving or homeless, right? But that doesn't. Maybe the wording is a little bit confusing when he says you can profit. Look at the people starving. This is an example. It's like, okay, I get what he's saying, right? Again, I don't think anybody would typically say that. You just need the free. I mean, it seems like he's arguing against like libertarians here. Maybe this video is not made for me, but let's keep going.
For example, mention climate change, where rather than mobilizing to reduce carbon emissions and improve our collective situation, companies would rather bribe and lie their way out of regulations and limitations on their businesses. Simply put, the supposed efficiency and quote-unquote rationality of the market is little more than a meme, and a bad one at that, especially when it's all built on a lie, since you have Chapter 3, Planning under Capitalism. Why, yes, planning as expansive, if not even more expansive, than ever occurred under the USSR takes place every single day in practically every firm under capitalism. Of course, in between firms, companies operate.
I remember this. I know what his argument's going to be.
On a market, but internally there is no market. Strange, as the market purists want you, and imperial perfect countries they extend criminal loans to believe that markets are the solution to everything at every time, everywhere. In reality, which sadly doesn't exist within those basic economics textbooks we're always told to consult, there's no internal market in large, well-functioning companies. The different departments, stores, trucks, and suppliers do not compete against each other in a market. Everything is actually coordinated. Walmart and Amazon are excellent examples of this phenomenon. These are no small economies either. Walmart's revenue is to the tune of around $500 billion, a little over half that of the USSR's GDP in the 70s. The comparison can't really be made accurately in this case, but it's just to give you an idea of the scale we're working with. But hold on.
Okay, I probably should mention that referencing the current revenue of Walmart to the GDP of the Soviet Union in the 1990s is probably not, there's probably some inflation that you should probably take into account there. But he says, well, hold on. So let's hold on and hear him out on this one.
The knowledge problem of Mises, in which there are far too many calculations to make and far too many inputs and outputs to keep track of, doesn't seem to be affecting Walmart or Amazon in the slightest. Well, simply, that's because he was wrong, or more appropriately, was limited by the period in history he was writing in. The exact details would make this video longer than it already.
So it's funny that he's skipping the exact details here, right? Because it seems like they're really, really desperately needed, right? So just because companies make decisions, like you could say they plan their sort of output based on an ordered amount of input, doesn't mean that they're not responding to price signals, right? So obviously there's a demand side that he seems to be neglecting here, right? So, if a company prices their products way too high, nobody will buy it. If they price it way too low, they're going to have empty shelves and they're going to leave a lot of money on the table, right? So I think it seems like the details are desperately needed here, because I think so far the argument that, well, ninja of physics, thanks for following me. So I think the argument so far, the idea that, well, there's an amount of planning that goes on in these companies, that's true. But as far as like hard wooden sock, thank you for following. Wooden socks. That doesn't sound very comfortable. But anyway, so I think the argument he's making here is probably it seems incomplete in my view. Muff Cheese, thanks for following me, good sir or madam or non-binary person. Let's keep going.
It is, so I'll leave the appropriate book recommendations at the end of the video for those interested.
There's the book recommendations. I figured it would happen.
But the complexity of Walmart versus an entire economy are two different things. Modern-day firms are islands of planning in a sea of market mechanisms, so you're still wrong, somehow.
These grievances aren't particularly incorrect, just more misplaced. Walmart, Amazon, and dozens of other massive companies are at the forefront of developing both supply networks as well as algorithms and software for maximizing their efficiency towards their final end, profit. This is a fine experiment, both in theory and in practice, of the tools that socialism can use towards the ends of a humane and truly rational economic model. Ironically, this really does reflect Marx's words: what the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers.
Well, it seems like he actually didn't. It's weird because he says that criticism is misplaced, but he doesn't really address the criticism. So, yeah, I mean, that's part of the argument that I would make. The idea that, like, oh, Walmart's just a big centrally planned economy, right? And it's like, number one, they're responding to price signals. They're also responding to market forces. Number two, obviously, when you're talking about Walmart, right, a department store, a grocery store, this is probably not quite as complex as Walmart also being in charge of how many cars to develop, what kind of cars, researching all those cars. Do we go to space? Do we not go to space? Right? What kind of all this kind of stuff, right? That's not to mention also that they don't actually like Walmart doesn't actually produce a lot of these things, right? A lot of the Walmart business model is mostly about shelf space, right? It's like, you're signing a contract for the product that you produce to go on Walmart shelves, and then Walmart fundamentally is just trying to determine, well, how much did your items sell from our shelves, right? They've got name brand, store brand stuff, but it's just it's a much, even though it's complex, it's a way, like 1,000 times simpler thing to plan and analyze than an entire inward and outward economy. I think that it's really important that he would have given more detail on this, but it seems like the section's about to end. So I feel like he's really underanalyzed that criticism, I think.
This isn't even mentioning the historic presence of planning in supposed capitalist success stories, such as South Korea and Japan. Planning is done all the time under capitalism. The only difference is, who's the planning done for?
I don't know what he means by planning. I mean, if he's talking about state industry and regulation and sort of rulemaking, again, this is something that most capitalists wouldn't have a problem with. Like, most capitalists don't have a problem with a state-run defense system, right? Most people don't argue for privatizing the military. Most people don't argue for privatizing the police or the fire department or things like that, right? Is that a form of planning? I mean, kind of, right? It's a single system, right? And so I can understand how you could say that that's planning, and it is, right? It's state industry. Many capitalists argue for a single payer system, right? State involvement in many different industries. Many capitalists would argue for national oil companies, right? And so I don't really understand how this is an argument against the economic calculation problem. I guess he's saying, well, your market mechanism isn't so perfect, and also you guys plan too, right? Which I think these things are very, very different. Yeah, I think essentially planning production and distribution of every resource in an economy equals planning a family trip to Disney World. They're both planning, right? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from, right? It's like, obviously, I plan what to turn my, the dial on my my thermostat or whatever, right? But that's a little bit less complex and a little bit easier to determine than like an entire economy. But obviously, he's not making that basic of a comparison. He's saying, like the whole, like Walmart's a big economy, right? And I don't think it's really comparable for a lot of reasons.
Chapter 4: Planning under Socialism and Supposed Inefficiencies.
All right,
planning was
we're getting into it. Hakim's model, let's do it.
In several countries. First and foremost amongst these is the USSR, the country that began as a backward land of peasants, devoid of industrial production, that within 3 decades became a modern nuclear superpower that conquered the cosmos. Now, this should go without saying, but modern planning will look very, very different than what it looked.
Conquered the cosmos. Man, that's a heck of an interpretation of the Soviet, the Soviet space system. But I guess that's might reveal some of Hakim's sort of predispositions that apparently the Soviet Union conquered the cosmos.
Like in the USSR, on account of our radically different conditions and levels of technology. For most of its existence, the USSR only planned a small group of inputs, around 10,000 out of an economy of over 10 million outputs, by hand. All this in light of constant international vilification, sabotage both internal and external, military threat, diplomatic isolation, economic sanctioning, on and on. The very fact that they managed to achieve what they did with these constraints is nothing less than impressive.
I feel like, so what he's saying here is that like the planning that the Soviet Union did would only be made a lot easier and would be a lot better with the technology we have today. But I feel like I don't know. I feel like the issue with this is like you'd probably see like Cuba or China or Vietnam. You see these like sort of socialist or like claims to be socialist societies implement those types of systems if they want, right? China's big goal is like basically unilaterally one thing. We want to industrialize, we want to modernize, we want to become an export economy. We've already done those three things. We want to continue to do those three things. And if planning, if like computerized central planning actually was more efficient than the sort of state capitalist, private organization that China's developed, then I mean, I feel like they would do it, and China has all the resources to do it if you don't want to consider Cuba or Vietnam. But I don't know, maybe he goes into it.
With that said, though, the supposed inefficiency of planning, particularly Soviet planning, is the main criticism aimed at socialism even to this day. Some of the honest criticisms have their place, while a lot of them are kind of in the vein of shooting somebody in the leg and then blaming them when they can't walk afterwards. Let's be fully clear. There were clear deficiencies of Soviet-era planning, some a result of their conditions, a lot more that they could have changed by their own hand, but didn't. It's outside the scope of this video to discuss this in depth, but we can briefly touch on it for now. The claim goes that, due to the sheer scale of bureaucratic tasks involved with planning a major economy, inefficiencies occur and the market is a superior option. This is explored by Cockshot when he says,
"If there are hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of distinct products, no central planning authority could hope to keep track of them all. Instead, they were forced to set gross targets for the outputs of different industries. For some industries, like gas or electric power, this was not a problem. Electricity and gas are undifferentiated. A kilowatt is a kilowatt, no argument. But when you turn to consumer goods, clothes for example, the range of products was too big and targets were set in terms of monetary output. The plan would specify a growth in the value of output clothing, furniture, etc. What this translated to then depended on the price structure. By resulting to monetary targets, the socialist economies were already conceding part of Mises's argument. They were resorting to the monetary calculation that he had declared to be vital to any economic rationality, but empirical evidence for the greater macroeconomic efficiency of markets, even when compared to classical Soviet planning, is on much thinner ground. As Allen, 2003, shows, the only capitalist economy whose long-term growth rate exceeded that of the USSR was Japan, whose own model was some way from unplanned capitalism. Compared to other countries starting out at the same economic level in the 1920s, the USSR grew considerably faster.
It's not all.
I think some of the issue here is that, it's I'm not so some people compare the economic growth of like the USSR to America, right? And that's a little bit unfair because obviously the USSR was industrializing, so you expect to see a lot of growth. Like for instance, right now, just because like India has a higher growth rate economically than America, that doesn't mean that the Indian economy is like more like better run than America, right? So it's probably important to keep that into consideration. He says, well, compare it to other sort of capitalist economies at the time. People say Brazil a lot of the times, and the USSR grew faster. I've got some criticisms for that in general because I think there's a lot sort of different circumstances and like goals of those nations, but hey, I think that fundamentally the point that some, like national industry and planning makes some sense, I think is pretty defensible. But the idea that like a totally centralized, sort of centrally planned economy is better or preferable to like market alternatives, it's kind of hard to make that case.
All doom and gloom for historic planning, though. In the early 90s, Morel, not a socialist by any regard, published an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives reviewing empirical studies of efficiency in the socialist planned economies. The results? Virtually all of them found that by standard neoclassical measures of efficiency, the planned economies performed as well or better than market economies. Of the 18 studies he reviewed concerning technical efficiency of firms and standardizing their methodologies, he got the following results. A 90% level of technical efficiency in capitalist firms, a level of 93% in Soviet firms, in another 84% versus 86%, in another 87% versus 95%, and so on. Practically identical.
I'm very skeptical of how this study sourced its data. Like, how do you get firm level data in the Soviet Union? That sounds incredibly difficult, but maybe it's actually very easy, and the Soviets were very transparent and open with their statistics. I would guess they were not, but I guess that's just me. I haven't read the study.
Furthermore, to the disappointment of those that decry the supposed soft budget constraints of socialist economies, meaning...
Well, yeah, Calamar, and I think that's a good point. Like, the idea is, like, you could make similar, like if I was making his level argument, I would say like, oh yes, look at South Korea and look at North Korea. Look how fucked North Korea is and look how great South Korea is. It's clearly because of capitalism and the markets, right? And if I were to say, let's look at West Germany and East Germany. Even today, East Germany is kind of fucked because of so much like problems with historical planning and association with the Soviet Union, right? You could say the same thing more starkly about West Berlin and East Berlin, right? Look at all the great high-rise buildings and industry and people are happy and stuff like that. And look at all the drab, droll stuff of the fucking East Berlin kind of style system, right? Why were so many people trying to flee over to West Berlin if it was so great in East Berlin? So you could make those arguments, but I think that they're not very charitable, and I don't know if they they probably don't tend to hold up in a nuanced discussion, really.
Since the social state had an interest in having firms succeed, those same firms have technically no hard budget limit, and somehow this leads to inefficiencies. The reality is that socialist economies had a pretty high level of allocative efficiency, which is the degree to which inputs are allocated among firms in a way that maximizes the total output. His research found that, even at 100% allocative efficiency of inputs, Soviet outputs would grow only by a meager 2%. Hilariously, in my research for this video, I found strange justifications for these sort of results from the pro-market side. Basically,
Oh yeah, Soviet planned economy was as efficient, if not more efficient at allocating resources, but that's because they didn't have technological innovation. Only the market can do that.
rarely do I see such concentrated scope. The fallacies of the above pro-market statements should be self-evident, so we'll move on. Building up from this point, another mistakenly held belief is that prices within planned economies were arbitrarily set exchange ratios without any relation to the relative scarcities or economic values of inputs. The idea being that only the market can set prices
Close to equilibrium levels.
This, too, is complete nonsense. Eric Dietzenbacher and Hans-Jürgen Wagner studied the phenomenon in comparing East and West German data, and found that the divergence from so-called optimal neoclassical prices to be identical between the two countries, 16.1% and 16.5%. Simply, the USSR and other planned socialist countries, despite having flawed systems of planning...
I wonder how you study that. Determining optimal pricing and the divergence thereof. That sounds like an interesting paper to read, in general, but, we'll see. I think that, again, I think here you could even accept that conclusion, right? Optimal pricing diversion, but then it's like, okay, well, what is the the outcome, right? And I don't know, it seems to me that people were fleeing East Germany and not West Germany, right? So it seems like people might have had a little bit better time, in West Germany than East Germany. So clearly there's something going on there, but he doesn't seem to respond to that in this video.
Planning that nonetheless relied on a form of price signaling still performed fairly well. That's not to say that their system of planning should be repeated, but it can be taken as an example to be studied and learned from. Furthermore, history has shown that planned economies, even with their historical shortcomings, prove
Wait, what did he just say?
flawed systems of planning that nonetheless relied on a form of price signaling still performed fairly well. That's not to say that their system of planning should be repeated, but it can be taken as an example to be studied and learned from. Furthermore,
I see.
history has shown that planned economies, even with their historical shortcomings, prove Mises and Hayek's criticisms to be generally unfounded. Chapter 5, The Future of Planning in Light of the Past.
Yeah, shaved dog's arse. I do stream Friday night and Saturday afternoon.
The fundamental assumptions behind the ECP is what is mistaken. What do markets do under capitalism? They are mechanisms for capital to reproduce itself. This behavior is rational in that it has a rationale, but it doesn't make it desirable for social ends. The point
I don't even know what he means by markets make it to where capital can reproduce itself. Right? Obviously, markets are just a mechanism to distribute scarce resources, just like planning is, right? So I don't know. Maybe he'll go into what that even means, but maybe someone can explain it. Maybe I'm small-brained, I guess.
The point of socialist economics isn't to replicate this, but to break the rule of capital altogether. The point isn't to beat the market at its own game, but to simply create a truly rational mechanism for the production and distribution of goods. Now that's all well and good for historic planning, but socialist planning in the future should look different, right? Well, you're exactly right. The core of Mises' argument is that prices and costs are the best way to compare between alternative forms of making things, and to arrive at that which is most efficient. Mises seems to miss the possibility of a socialist economy setting internal prices, not as an expression of market value, but as an expression of alternative options in order to move resources between enterprises. With enough data and enough math, you can calculate your way to efficient prices. But even that is unnecessary. The modern argument, which has its roots as early as the 1930s, is to use labor time as an alternative to prices, something Mises himself conceded. Furthermore, with modern computing, it wouldn't be too difficult to maintain up-to-date figures for the labor.
I don't understand. So he's saying labor time is better than pricing, but you could just make the same theoretical arguments against that as you could against perfect competition, right? Okay, well, in theory, you could do all kinds of shit, right? It's more about, like, practically what does it look like? And I guess now he's going to go into the computerized systems, so...
cost of each input to the production process.
But labor values have limitations.
Yes, but so do prices. Any scalar measure will have limitations as production is a multifactorial process. As previously mentioned, this issue has been solved nearly a century ago at this point. Kantorovich developed a form of in-kind calculation, meaning a non-monetary form of meeting the general constraints of production on top of labor time. No need for prices, and efficient too.
Bevan says he means that markets exist for the purpose of capitalists to compound on capital creation. It's a Marxist thing. Maybe you can link me to what that... I don't know how you can make that argument that that's why markets exist, right? That yes, the person who invented the market, like this is what they had in mind, right? Markets seem almost organic to the human experience to some extent, right? After all, one of the ways that China was pushed to liberalize and become a little bit more market oriented was sporadic and decentralized market mechanisms being created amongst the farming population. So it's I don't know. It just seems like the idea that, some price mechanisms and like some thought of, like market determination of goods and services is a way by which we might distribute sort of scarce resources, or we might know what to produce, essentially.
It was never applied in the USSR due to the limitations of technology at the time, but by the 1990s, the story changed. What this means is that, since the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR, all of the criticisms of Mises and Hayek and co. have more or less no place in modern discussion. The exact details of modern planning is outside the scope of this video, but
Oh god, I can't believe he's about to reference a
Take a look at
fucking
Gottschalk's
book again.
excellent toward
Oh no. This whole video has been just a criticism of Mark. He hasn't even gotten to why economic calculation can't work. He finally gets to, yes, new planning. I'm Hakim. Here's what I can tell you about socialist planning in the modern world. Well, it's different. However, the scope of this video, talking about the economic calculation problem, it's outside the scope of this video. And so here's a book that I'm going to reference that you take a look at. God, I really hope he gets into what planning in his system actually looks like, because without talking about what planning could look like in a the positive case, it just seems like this video is very, very incomplete. But maybe he gets, I don't know, let's see. It's been a while since I've seen this. Let's see what he gets into. He references a book. Maybe he talks about it a little bit.
towards a new socialism, in which he lays out a lot of the how and why with empirical evidence. Don't worry, more book recommendations are to come, as always. Look, the knowledge problem isn't a problem anymore. The rational allocation problem isn't a problem.
He's saying these aren't problems. He hasn't explained why they aren't problems. He's literally said, well, there's not problems. Here's a book to read. I don't know. I mean, again, I haven't read those books. Maybe they're very convincing arguments, but I don't know. I just feel like if you're making a video about this, you'd want to, like I said, you'd want to make a more positive case for like what his version of rational planning is in a computerized system. Tarkov Survivor just clicked follow. Thank you for clicking follow.
Problem anymore. The pearl clutching, but no price signals problem isn't a problem anymore. I'd argue most of these weren't even problems to begin with. Our future goal is to develop systems of wide and all-encompassing.
Yeah, I mean, he's hand waving this. This isn't a problem. This isn't a problem. This isn't a problem. But he's not. There's no positive case being made here.
Participation between enterprises and planning committees, and vice versa. Countless ideas exist, and all that's missing is some software and a bit of organization. Capitalism truly does create is gravediggers.
All that's missing is a bit of software. And what did he say?
Countless ideas exist, and all wide and all-encompassing democratic participation between enterprises and planning committees, and vice versa. Countless ideas exist, and all that's missing is some software and a bit of organization.
Some software and a bit of organization. That's all you could say that about anything. You could say that about anything. This is a very incomplete argument in my view.
Capitalism truly does create is gravediggers. Chapter 6, the failure of argumentum ad ECPM. In this section, we can touch on how the ECP fails on several fronts as an argument against socialism. If you particularly hate yourself, this Cato Institute article really lays out all the tired claims of this argument. At first, they claim Mises' critique of the ECP has never been debunked. I assume they haven't done any of the reading because this is just not true. There isn't even just one debunking of it, by the way, there are several. They then go on to repeat the price nonsense, the idea that prices are somehow better descriptors of behavior in an economy, which is patently false, as we've already discussed. Economist Joe Robinson argued that many prices
I feel like he's just repeating himself now.
in modern capitalism are effectively administered prices, created by quasi-monopolies, which challenges the connection between capital markets and the so-called rational resource allocation that happens in a market. But that's beside the point, though. Prices, too, lose fidelity because they cannot contain and transmit all the information necessary for the relative material circumstances, as well as describe the overall costs or benefits of certain actions. Prices are only good enough for maximizing profits. Prices won't tell you the impact of greenhouse gases on the environment, nor will they take into account inability to access private healthcare. These two are costs and information relevant to society, yet prices don't give a damn. This of course ties back into the idea of so-called rational planning and how pro-market and socialist voices view what exactly is rational differently. Polluting a river because it's cheaper than properly taking care of waste is rational to the pro-market side, while providing a rural mountainous community with healthcare, despite it being wildly unprofitable, is rational to the socialists.
But that's why government interference exists.
But we're no longer in the textbook uniformly competitive market picture in that case. Also, that statement betrays the truth that
I don't think anybody that makes the calculation problem says that you I don't not that anybody would. I don't think most people would say markets are literally perfect at distributing goods. That's why you don't need any resource sort of oversight by the government, right? You can very much make the statement that you need government involvement in markets, and also say that the economic calculation problem is a serious flaw in central planning. He's failed completely to make a positive. I mean, he's just, I don't know. Maybe the people watching maybe you can point out where he's made like an actual, like he said, the people that argue this are dumb. Markets aren't actually that great. Hey, planning actually happens under capitalism. He's also said that what was the next chapter? It was the planning under socialism. He said planning under socialism wasn't actually that bad, and it would be a lot better today. Here's a book to read that goes into how it would be better. But I feel like this whole video should be how planning today could be better, right? Maybe he's made that video, but anyway.
Even the most pro-market pundits know that markets aren't all that efficient when it comes to stuff other than maximizing profits. The ideology game is fickle, you see. They go on to meme about,
without prices, there is no effective way to allocate resources at a societal level in service of consumers.
Again, they don't see the fundamental failing that is serving consumers, meaning whatever is profitable. Again, capitalism has shortages all the time, you just don't see them unless you're poor. Also, the aforementioned research earlier in the video has shown this to be also false. They go on to waffle about Walmart and Amazon not being valid examples for socialism in the book, the people of probably Walmart, despite not having read the book, it seems, as the book's entire argument is, and I quote, all of this hints at how economic planning on a massive scale is being realized in practice with the assistance of technological advance, even as the wrangling
I feel like he's just repeating himself, so I'm just gonna go 2x on this one because he seems to be responding to. This is like a shortened version of the video we just watched, so I'm just gonna, hopefully you guys can tolerate it.
Of infinite data, according to Mises and co-thinkers in the calculation debate, are supposed to be impossible to overcome. The foundation stones are being laid. It doesn't matter if there's only infra-firm planning currently under capitalism. According to neoclassical nonsense, this already is heresy. The market is supposed to be the best at everything. The failed experiments of Sears and other companies in having infra-firm market competition failed, and failed spectacularly. The book goes into this in great detail. Planning within a single firm can grow into planning of all society. So their limp dismissal of the book and its arguments really comes across as nothing more than an ineffective coping mechanism.
Planning into a single firm can grow to planning in all society is completely not true. I don't know where foundationally it seems like he hasn't set up the bedrock of that argument.
They go on to state that planning is inefficient in the example of the USSR, which has already been discussed and shown to be false. Then they trip on their own claims of that supposed inefficiency by saying the USSR invented and innovated pretty well, actually, but just didn't have the institutional arrangements to turn inventions into marketable or consumer products. Yes, that's apparently an argument. The entire rest of the article can be summarized as what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. Basically, fuck it and do whatever you like business-wise, it'll magically benefit society on a whole. We've seen how well that train of thought has worked out in the current climate catastrophe. Little more than ideology clouding rational thought, a favorite pastime of these types. Another strange claim I see floating around is the idea that saying computers generally help in solving this ECP non-issue is somehow incorrect. Basically, the same claim of the market being more efficient, quote unquote, let's play what exactly does efficiency mean though game again. That planning would have to exponentially expand and develop ever superior AI to even meet the basic form of the market, let alone surpass it. What this misses is that the aim isn't to beat the market at efficiency, no matter how you define efficiency. The market is garbage at that already. Even by profit maximization standards, planned economies did a decent job at that too. That's beside the point though. The point is to do a good enough job so that production is maximized in a rational way, so that all base needs of the population are met. We're not aiming to create markets by circuits and silicon. We don't need to replicate the market with computers. Our aim is to replace it altogether.
But a planned economy will have no freedom and no right to property and no
Blah blah, same tired arguments you've heard a million times already. There's no freedom under capitalism when you have to sell your labor power to survive. And private property, meaning that which is used to expansion of capital, as Marx said, has already been done away with for 9/10 of the population. How many stats on global inequality and how half of the Earth's wealth is in the hands of like 10 people do you need to see before the truth hits you?
I mean, I think there's a big difference between you have to work and the computerized algorithm is forcing you to work in a certain job. There seems to be a difference between like you can work in a competitive labor market, but you probably need to work to survive versus like, yes, citizen, here's your, AI generated job that you have to do. I don't know. That seems a little weird to me.
On a side note, why do these types defend billionaires so much? The economists are on a payroll, so I get their grift, but some dude sitting in Arkansas behind a monitor. Honestly, why?
But the USSR fell apart.
Which they explain without knowing the first thing about Soviet economic planning, political structure, or social organization. The first experiment of socialism on a large scale achieved amazing feats, even with all the hurdles in its way. That's not what I would consider a failure, especially given that it was the first ever attempt. I think the pro-capitalist economist Brian Kaplan said it fairly well. The collapse of communism has led Austrians to loudly claim that Mises was right. However, current events do nothing to show that economic calculation was the insuperable difficulty of socialist economies. There's no natural experiment of a socialist economy that suffered solely from its lack of economic calculation. Thus, economic history, as well as pure economic theory, fails to establish that the economic calculation problem was ever a severe challenge for socialism. Honestly, there's so many problems with this argument that I barely scratched the surface. Deeper critiques get a lot more mathematical and boring, so I've omitted them, but you're more than free to check out the further reading section at the end of the video if you're interested. Pretty much every objection raised, both common and obscure, is covered by the many sources and PDFs I link. If you were to read only a single one though, I recommend it be Cottrell and Cockshot's Calculation, Complexity, and Planning, the Socialist Calculation Debate once again. All of this can be found in the pinned comment. Chapter 7. Market Socialism as a Solution. For those who have read further into this topic, you'd definitely be aware of the many market socialist models that have been developed over the years. From Alec No's work to Lange's models, there are several market-dependent social setups that exist that claim to meet the critique of Mises' Hakim, though, to differing extents. I personally am of the opinion that market solutions, be they so-called socialist or not, aren't solutions at all. This video is long enough though, so I'll bullet point my arguments here. Markets can only provide information on individuals and their market engagement. Markets are incapable of providing meaningful information about the social effects of said private market engagement. Markets rely on investment relative to other investments to measure productivity. Investment decisions require long-run estimates of collective needs, but prices reflect only present data. Investment is limited on a temporal basis by the short-sightedness of market decisions. To quote McNally, how is the market to regulate decisions with respect to public goods, which will, at least in large measure, be consumed by the next generation? If market regulation does exist and relies on prices in the wider sense, meaning planning prices, as in terms on which alternatives are offered, there's no reason why such planning prices couldn't be determined without resorting to market regulation. Private, small-scale markets in either only consumer goods or solely so-called luxury goods have a place in the argument, as Cockshott and McNally state. If we're going to have collective state directives to such a deep level, though, why even have markets at all? There's a lot more to this, but honestly, I'm supposed to be on break, so I can't bring myself to extend this video another 5 minutes for this point. Do forgive my laziness here, but take a look at the further reading. Conclusion. Today, we have scratched the surface of possibly one of the most boring and pointless discussions on socialism over the past century. Historic planning had its issues, further planning most likely will as well. But anything is better than the reckless anarchy of the market that implodes on itself every couple of years, only to risk humanity's survival further, be it through climate change, the collapse of social and economic structures threatening war, or even boring things like the implicit inability of markets to meet the actual needs of people. Our future in planning won't take form overnight, nor will it be easy, but it will be necessary. Most importantly of all, though, it's definitely doable. I have some recommended reading for you, as always, and this includes The People's Republic of Walmart by Philip Zimmer-Zworsky, a decent introductory book into the topic, generally, but it reproduces some of the usual anti-Soviet remarks, especially when commenting on the early economic discussions within the USSR. Seems you can't get published without them. The rest of the book is decent, though. Then we have McNally's Against the Market, which too is decent. He's a trot, though, and doesn't let you forget it, but his arguments, particularly against market socialist are pretty good. Finally, I had the pleasure of recommending Cockshott's new book, How the World Works, which is an absolute masterpiece of a book. Incredibly ambitious. I might even say over-ambitious. It touches on so many points so beautifully that I'm actually telling you to go and read it right now. The second half of the book, directly relating to socialism.
I might say overly ambitious. What is that? What does he mean by that? I'd be so curious to ask him that question.
Economy is indispensable. Go, right now. Finally, Towards New Socialism, also by Cockshott. I've recommended this like 1,000 times now, and if you haven't read it, then honestly, I don't know what you're doing, but in your spare time, go and give it a read. It's easy to read, it's very entertaining, and it answers so many questions. It's a great book, honestly. And that's that, finally. If you like what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Pan-Semitic Communist, Daniel Sack, Person, Sexy Socialist, Joshua B. Everidge, Carl Mailing, Noah Abbas, Victor...
All right, so he thanks his Patreons and pieces out. I would give... I just... There's real problems in this video, in my opinion, right? I feel like he really, really fails to analyze the the case for like a more computerized planning in the modern world. He hand waves almost all the criticisms associated with that, or like he hand waves all the positives associated, and literally says, well, well, obviously these things aren't problems today because we have computers, right? And I don't know. I feel like even if what he's saying is theoretically true, I feel like the problem is obviously, well, a country like China, a country like Vietnam, a country like Cuba, these are countries that would prefer to be that would implement those types of systems if they proved that it would be more sort of competitive for their economy, right? I mean, for as much as these guys defend those types of economic arrangements, well, I mean, why don't they implement the most amazing computerized cockshottian, centrally planned system if that's the case? I mean, I just feel like this video is it is an incredibly uncharitable and typically poor sort of interpretation of how economists and economic thinkers view markets, and it seems like quite a incomplete video when it comes to the actual case for planning in the modern world in general. So